Hello, my name is Jo Woolf and I'm Writer-in-Residence at the Royal Scottish Geographical Society. And in this talk for the RSGS's Inspiring People at Home series, I would like to tell you about some of my favourite items in the collections at RSGS and the reasons why I think they're so interesting, whether they're artefacts or images, newspaper cuttings or written records. They each give a fascinating and unique glimpse into the lives of some of the explorers who were connected with the Society over its long history. So the first item that I'd like to show you is this beautiful little matchbox. Now this is connected with an eminent Edinburgh cartographer by the name of George Bartholomew, and he was one of the co-founders of the Society. George was the honorary secretary of the Society for many years, and he welcomed explorers from all over the world to come and give lectures to the Society and to receive awards. So he really was like the driving force that got the whole Society moving. Now the idea of establishing a Scottish Geographical Society first occurred to him in 1884, and he put this idea to his friend Agnes Livingston Bruce, who was the daughter of the famous explorer David Livingstone, while they were walking together on the beach below North Berwick in July of that year. Now Agnes Livingston Bruce thought this was a wonderful idea to have a geographical society in Scotland, and so they both went ahead and obtained the backing of lots of eminent geographers, among them Sir James Geekie. And by the autumn of that year, the Scottish Geographical Society was up and running with a very fast-growing membership. And to commemorate that conversation on the beach, Agnes Livingston Bruce gave her friend George Bartholomew this beautiful little silver matchbox as a memento of their conversation. It's inscribed with the monogram JGB, the Society's emblem or crest, along with the date, the 20th of July 1884, and the words North Berwick. And it's obviously been very well used because it's quite worn in places. It's such a tiny little thing, so precious, and it's so important and so unique because it sits at the very core of the Society, representing really the spark of an idea from which so much good and so much fantastic work has sprung. Now the second item I would like to show you is a newspaper cutting, and this actually shows, it's a really great example of how much you can learn from newspapers, especially the ones from the sort of the late 1800s and early 1900s, because they contain so much information that might otherwise have been lost. And in the case of the explorers who visited the RSGS, they sometimes reproduced the entire lecture word for word, so that's really valuable when you're looking at the lives and the adventures of these explorers. And this particular newspaper cutting is from the Scotsman, and it's dated the 13th of November 1891. And it's about a lecture that was given by Mrs. Isabella Bishop, otherwise known by her maiden name Isabella Bird. And it took place in the Free Assembly Hall in Edinburgh. And Isabella's topic for her lecture was the Upper Karawan region and the Bakhtiari country, in other words, part of Iran, which she'd just finished exploring. She'd just come back from there. Now she was introduced by the chairman, Major General Sir R. Murdoch Smith, and he said, he made it quite clear that this was the first time the session of the Society was to be opened by a lady. And he said a lady on whom, for her eminent services to geography, the Society had just conferred its honorary fellowship. Now this was really important because it was still the very early days of the Society, and it was already giving fellowships to women, and it was also welcoming women into the memberships of the Society, and women were regularly attending lectures, which was quite unusual for that time. Now Isabella was a force to be reckoned with. She had some stories to tell. She was a supreme example in the restricted Victorian age of what a woman could actually do when she put her mind to it. because of course at that time it was really hard for a woman to lead a life of independence and adventure. It would be frowned on. And in this talk that she gave, she described her adventures as she was travelling through Luristan. She was travelling by mule over difficult terrain, difficult mountain passes. She was on her own, apart from some local guides that she hired as she went along. It was dangerous country. She was telling how blood feuds were common. She was robbed, she was attacked, and she was fired on, and had to run for her life on several occasions. There was a lot of violence between the local tribes. But she still went on to find out about the social structure of the villages, their customs and their dress, and their agriculture and their beliefs, and she described all these to the society in her talk. Now, Isabella, as I said, she was the most incredible woman. She was one of the most inspirational figures in her era, really, in terms of women. She was born in Yorkshire in 1831. And so she was 60 at the time of her talk to the RSGS. She had already had quite a long life of adventure. Her first solo expedition was to Hawaii. And from then she went to Colorado. That was when she was in her 40s, and spent some time in the Rocky Mountains. And from then she explored much of Asia, including Japan and China, Vietnam, Korea, Singapore and Malaysia, and she fell in love with the Far East. She used to travel with an oil lamp in one pocket of her dress and a revolver in the other. She wasn't standing any nonsense at all. She was very practical, but she also loved the drama and she loved the excitement of new discoveries. One of my favourite quotes by Isabella is from her time in Colorado. While she was travelling to Colorado on board a vessel that was in the high seas and being pitched about by storms, she said, "I sat down and knitted for some time. My usual resource under discouraging circumstances," which I think just shows what sort of undaunted woman she was. She was also one of the earliest travel photographers. She learned how to process her own films in the field. She would strap a camera to the bottom of her travelling chair when she was travelling by chair. And when she camped for the night, she sometimes camped in the most awful, they were the sort of ruined buildings that were infested with rats and all other kinds of vermin. And she used to have to hang her clothes on her camera tripod so that the rats couldn't chew them. She said, "With absolute security from vermin, all else can be cheerfully endured," which I think is a brilliant quote. So she was a very successful photographer. And it's interesting that at the close of her lecture to the RSGS, she showed what they called an admirable series of limelight views from photographs of her journey. Now, Isabella had a house at one time in Tobermory on the Isle of Mull. And she loved Tobermory. She went there whenever she wasn't travelling abroad. She had been married for 5 years to an Edinburgh surgeon, John Bishop, but unfortunately was widowed within 5 years and then went back to her life of worldwide exploration. She came back to the RSGS as a lecturer in 1897, and she did a little tour of Scotland. She visited Edinburgh, Glasgow, Glasgow, Aberdeen and Dundee. And she obviously loved her time here. She said, "I never addressed so sympathetic and enthusiastic an audience. It was altogether a very pleasant journey." So a lovely little story there, just from newspaper cuttings in the collections at RSGS. Now, when it comes to exploration, you really can't get much more iconic than Sir Ernest Shackleton. Now, these are some of my very favourite things in the RSGS collections. It's a series of photographs of Shackleton and the crew of his ship Endurance just before they set off on what was formerly known as the Imperial Trans-Antarctic Expedition, which would be Shackleton's third visit to the Antarctic. And in fact, the RSGS also has a map, an original map annotated by Shackleton showing his intended route. He actually wanted to cross the Antarctic from coast to coast during this expedition, but sadly that wasn't to be. the ship became trapped in the ice in November 1915 and sank to the bottom of the ocean, and Shackleton and his men only really just escaped with their lives. They had to struggle to survive, first of all drifting on ice floes, and then eventually Shackleton and 5 comrades embarked on an open sea voyage of 800 miles from Elephant Island to South Georgia to raise the alarm and eventually to get assistance to rescue the rest of his men. So a huge challenge lay ahead of Shackleton at this point when these photographs were taken, but of course he had no knowledge of that at all, no idea what was in store for him. So these photographs were taken on the 16th of July 1914 in the Southwest India Dock in London, just as the Endurance was preparing to depart. And they show Queen Alexandra and her sister Maria, the Empress of Russia, paying a formal visit to the ship and the crew before they departed for the Antarctic. The photo I'd like to show you shows the officers all with their hats in their hand, giving 3 cheers for the Queen, Shackleton there as well. And then when you turn it over, there's Shackleton's handwriting on the back saying officers cheering the Queen. If you have a look at the photo again, in white, the lady in white with the white hat is Emily Shackleton, that was Shackleton's wife, and 2 of their children, Cecily, the little girl, and Edward. And the second photo in the same series, Shackleton is now escorting the 2 royal ladies down the gangplank at the end of their visit, just making sure that they're safe there. And on the reverse, again, he's written his own caption and he's just said, "Leaving the Endurance." And from the reports of the time, various details have emerged that the Queen presented Shackleton and his crew with various souvenirs for good fortune. She gave them a large Bible and a medallion showing St. Christopher, the patron saint of ferrymen. Now, by 1914, Queen Alexandra was actually a widow. Her husband, Edward VII, had died in 1910, and the reigning monarch was her son, George V. Maria, her sister, was the mother of Tsar Nicholas of Russia, who was assassinated with his family in 1918. So some momentous occasions in history, and also, of course, the First World War lay in the immediate future. Shackleton, of course, already had very strong ties with the Royal Scottish Geographical Society. He'd been secretary of the Society in 1904 and 1905, and he was a long-standing council member. And he returned after his expeditions to give talks to groups of the RSGS. He was a great speaker. He could hold audiences in the palm of his hand. He had a real sense of drama and of humour, and he had such a captivating way of telling stories. And after the Endurance expedition, when he arrived home, he came to give lectures and showed photographs of the ship that had been taken, the dramatic photographs of the ship trapped in the ice, about to sink, and of the rescue mission that he mounted himself. And afterwards, a few years after he came back from the Endurance expedition, he returned to the Antarctic for a 4th and final time in 1921, and sadly he died there on board his ship, the Quest, of probably a heart attack or some kind of heart condition in January 1922. So there is a whole lot of history encapsulated in these photographs, and the fact that they have also got Shackleton's own handwriting on them, it just seems to bring him that little bit closer, and I just love them. Now, the next thing I'd like to show you is something that I really just stumbled on by accident, which is actually sometimes how you find the most interesting things. And it was concerning an event which at the time caused a worldwide sensation, and it also revealed a real coup for the RSGS at the time. Now, it happened in November 1922, and this was the discovery of Tutankhamun's tomb in the Valley of the Kings in Egypt. Tutankhamun being an ancient Egyptian pharaoh, the enigmatic boy king that had tantalized historians for so long. Now, Howard Carter at that time was an eminent Egyptologist, and he'd already been in Egypt for 31 years. excavating and finding artifacts. And by 1922, items bearing the name of Tutankhamun had already been found in other excavations, so they suspected that a significant tomb lay nearby, but they just couldn't find it. And in Carter's final season, he had been given a certain length of time to dig by his sponsor, who was Lord Carnarvon. In his final season, he noticed some steps, some ancient steps beneath some workmen's huts that they'd been working on. And these steps led to a blocked entrance. Now, there were several seals on the bottom of the door that suggested that Tutankhamun lay inside. So they investigated, they found a passageway leading to another doorway, and Carter made a tiny breach in this doorway, in this entranceway, and put a candle inside the chamber that was enclosed inside to light it up to see what was inside. And he said, "As my eyes grew accustomed to the light, details of the room within emerged slowly from the mist. Strange animals, statues, and gold, everywhere the glint of gold." And he just didn't know what to say. He was speechless with what he could see. And his sponsor, Lord Carnarvon, who was standing just by him, said, "Can you actually see anything?" And Carter said, "Yes, wonderful things." And he knew that he'd found the tomb, which was still intact, pretty much intact, of Tutankhamun. Now, this image actually shows Lord Carnarvon there on the left, his daughter, Lady Evelyn Herbert, in the centre, and Howard Carter there on the right. So this discovery took place in November 1922, and the world was going mad wanting more news, because this was one of the first really intact tombs that had been found in Egypt, and the imaginations were going mad all over the world as to what actually lay inside the chamber. And the RSGS had obviously picked up on this, and on the 30th of January 1923, there's a handwritten note in the council minutes of the Society directing the lecture committee to take steps immediately to secure a lecture, if possible, from Lord Carnarvon. So obviously they made inquiries, but looking at the way history panned out, unfortunately Lord Carnarvon died in April 1923, just a couple of months after this note was made. And in quite mysterious circumstances, there was talk at the time that the curse of the pharaohs had had some effect in his untimely death. But anyway, the RSGS plans were not derailed, because in the council minutes of June 1923, there is a further note saying that they had actually managed to secure Howard Carter himself as a speaker. And although he couldn't undertake to lecture until the middle of September, he had actually consented to speak to them. Now, on the 10th of September, this lecture took place in Edinburgh, and it was a huge occasion because it seems as if this was the very first lecture that Carter had given since his discovery of Tutankhamun's tomb. Now, at this time, only the antechamber had been opened, and although that had yielded the most amazing artifacts, it wasn't fully excavated at the time, but he was already astounded by the wonderful things that they found. He showed slides of the items, and he said that when the sealed doors of the tomb, the innermost tomb, were opened, he believed that they would find the king himself unscathed, untouched by the robbers, and probably with him would be the crowns of Egypt and other regalia of Tutankhamun. That was what he said, that was reported in the Scotsman newspaper at the time. And of course, when the tomb was opened a couple of years later, Carter did indeed find the sarcophagus of the king, the innermost coffin being made of solid gold, and the mummy of the king being covered with the incredible gold mask. It was absolutely sensational. And it was interesting as well to see that Howard Carter said that it had given him great pleasure to deliver his first lecture on his discoveries in Edinburgh. A magnificent city, he said, which he had never seen before. And we even have a couple of signatures in the visitors' book from the time Howard Carter's signature there being made on the occasion that he visited the society. So a lovely little glimpse into history and another lovely little story from the archives of the RSGS. The next thing I'd like to show you relates to one of my favourite explorers, and her name is Isabel Wylie Hutchison. She was born at Carlowry Castle in West Lothian in 1889, and she was always drawn to the lands of the Arctic. She spent much of her life trekking and travelling by dog sled or by ship or by lots of other means of transport across the tundra, collecting flowers. She was a botanist, a plant collector, and she also collected artifacts and stories. She collected stories and poems and songs from the indigenous people who lived there and that she made friends with. Now, in the RSGS collections, we're very lucky to have some albums of photographs of Isabel's, and some of these are annotated in her handwriting, so she's actually labelled all the negatives very meticulously in her own handwriting. First of all, documenting her trip to Greenland. She was the first Scotswoman to ever set foot in Greenland in 1927, and this album contains lots of negatives of her trip there, the people that she met, the expeditions that she took. There are some lovely photos of her picnicking on the side of a fjord with some of the people who went on a plant collecting trip with her. And what I love about Isobel is that she's always happy. She always looks as if she's enjoying herself and having a fabulous time. And some of the other photos that we have show her standing on board ships, in charge of dog sled teams or sitting in log cabins. And she was always optimistic. She always believed that the best would happen. And the photos that we have that she took tell such a lovely story. Some of them aren't the best quality, but when you consider the conditions that she was working in and the fact that she was developing these photographs herself in the field, you've got to give her credit for them. You know, she was making a unique record of her travels at a time when women certainly didn't travel across the Arctic tundra on their own, or take their lives in their hands on their own and make their own arrangements. So she was pretty much breaking the mold in that respect. Now, Isobel had a long connection with the RSGS, and she was presented with the Mungo Park Medal for her expeditions on the 24th of October 1934. Now, this year was a very special occasion for the RSGS because it was the Golden Jubilee of the Society. And so the Society held a special banquet in the North British Station Hotel in Edinburgh, which is now the Balmoral. And this photo shows the occasion just before the event took place. Now, they had a very special guest to mark the Jubilee, who was the patron of the Society, and that was the Duke of York, the later King George VI. And this photograph shows the Duke of York there in the kilt, together with the Lord Provost of Edinburgh, Sir William Thompson, on the left, Lord Elphinstone next to him, who was the president of the RSGS, the Duke of York, and there on the right, Lord Meston, who was also receiving a medal. Now, because this was 1934, it would be 2 years before King Edward VIII abdicated and propelled his younger brother, the Duke of York, onto the throne. So this was all very much in the future. The Duke of York had no idea that he was going to be king. And also, which has come up quite a lot just recently, the Duke of York had a stammer, which is portrayed in the movie The King's Speech, which shows very well the intense pressure that he felt before addressing the nation on the eve of World War II. And his speech at that time is always portrayed as being his first live broadcast. But in fact, his first live public broadcast happened sooner than that. It happened at the RSGS banquet in 1934. And the only way that I found this out was by looking much later on, again in the newspaper cuttings, when the Society's secretary, John Bartholomew, who was a descendant of the founder, John George Bartholomew, wrote that the first occasion on which His Majesty broadcast to the public was actually at this banquet. And so that led me to look at the scheduling, the radio schedules for that day. And there it was. The broadcast happened at 9:10 p.m. on the 24th of October 1934 over the radio in Scotland, and it lasted for 20 minutes. So Bartholomew was correct, and the first King's speech, although he was still only Duke of York at the time, happened in Edinburgh, and it happened at the RSGS banquet in 1934. And Bartholomew later wrote, "Those who were present could form some idea of the tremendous effort called for facing the microphone to overcome his tragic difficulty in speech. They liked to think that the confidence he gained in later years in his Happy Christmas broadcasts had in no small way its beginning in that first successful triumph in their midst." So that was a lovely story, and I love the fact that it was the Duke of York who presented Isobel with her medal, because she was such a special person, and although she was so modest and self-effacing, she would never have wanted any limelight, but she certainly deserved it. And so it was lovely that she got to have her medal presented by such a significant figure, and such a significant figure in the history of Britain, let alone the history of Scotland and the society. So it's a lovely story to have. Now, in 1969, there was probably no one more famous in the entire world than Neil Armstrong, who in July of that year was the first man ever to set foot on the surface of the moon. Armstrong was the commander of NASA's Apollo 11 moon landing mission. He was born in Ohio in 1930, and he was an experienced US naval pilot before he began training to become an astronaut. When he stepped onto the moon from the landing capsule called the Eagle, he was closely followed by the astronaut Buzz Aldrin, while their colleague Michael Collins, the third member of the mission, stayed behind in the spaceship which was in orbit around the moon. Now, of course, when the astronauts safely returned to Earth, they were absolutely inundated with accolades, and the RSGS invited Armstrong to Scotland to receive the prestigious Livingstone Medal. Armstrong arrived in Edinburgh on the 9th of March 1972, and in the evening there was a prestigious reception and a medal presentation and a talk which he gave in the Usher Hall. Now, the photograph here shows Armstrong receiving the medal from the RSGS president, Lord Bellerno, and he very helpfully signed his name in the visitor's book with Apollo 11 afterwards in brackets, almost as if out of modesty we wouldn't be quite sure who he was in years to come. Now, Armstrong had quite a few busy days ahead of him when he came to Scotland. The day after he gave the talk in Edinburgh to the RSGS, he delivered the Mountbatten lecture to Edinburgh University. And then the day after, he travelled down to the Scottish borders to Langham, which is the traditional homeland of the Armstrongs. And he was given a very warm reception there by the townspeople and given a tour of some of the famous landmarks. Now, Neil Armstrong retired from NASA in 1971, and he accepted a teaching position in the University of Cincinnati. And it was from there that he wrote to the RSGS shortly after his visit, thanking the society very warmly for their hospitality shown towards him and his wife, Jean. In the letter, he thanks them for their personal thought, which was obviously very much appreciated. He says, "Your quiet dinner and the lovely Scottish jewellery were the added touches that ensured warm memories for years to come." So that was really nice. He obviously had long and really nice lasting memories of his reception in Scotland. And what a fantastic man he was. You know, although he was famously very modest, very quiet, he didn't really want the limelight. People said that he had a mind that absorbed things like a sponge and a memory that remembered them like a photograph. That was a quote from one of his test pilots, his fellow test pilots. And his co-astronaut Michael Collins said that as long as there are history books, Neil Armstrong will be included in them, remembered for taking humankind's first small steps on a world beyond our own. So a truly iconic figure and a wonderful man to finish this little tour of the archives of the Society. So just to conclude, that is just a very small and fairly random selection of some of the items that are held in the collections of the Royal Scottish Geographical Society. I think they're all amazing because for me they tell stories, or they represent a small part of a much bigger story. And because they're so tangible, they just bring you that little bit closer to the people who either wrote them or took them or brought them or donated them. Just a little personal glimpse of somebody who was so incredible for various unique reasons, and that's why I love them. The RSGS has so many stories to share, and many of them are shared already on their blog. Go to their website and navigate to their blog, and you'll find lots more of these wonderful stories about explorers throughout the Society's 135-year history. So pop along to their website or check out their social media and you'll find lots more to read. And thank you very much for listening. I hope you've enjoyed it and I hope it's inspired you, and thank you.